Welcome to this webinar on climate, health, food, agriculture, nexus, sponsored by the Australian Academy of Scientific Technology and Engineering and by the Agriculture and Food Forum of that group. May I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet in Australia and pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. Their knowledge is so important for us as we move ahead to take on and manage this climate crisis. My name is John Dixon. I am chair of the ACT division of the Academy and also work with a small group, Wendy Craig and Wallace Cowling, who I think is online today, in order to identify webinars for the Agriculture and Food Forum. We all know that climate change is an existential threat. It's huge, it's complex, it's dynamic, and it's uncertain. And we certainly don't have all the science or all the technology that we need, or even all the knowledge to cope with and manage our mitigation, adaptation, and resilience requirements going forward. So the focus is somewhat unknown, and we'll talk about that somewhat today, but also the linkages between the different areas of science and technology. Specifically today, we'll be talking about linkages between health, food, and agriculture, and what that means for scientific collaboration and for the development of better technologies moving forward, as well as better policies. We have 60 minutes for the webinar today. We'll have two speakers, two esteemed, insightful speakers who've been working with this subject for a long time, and we'll follow that with a Q&A. We will be taking questions from the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screens. Please don't forget to pop in your questions as the speakers are presenting. Now it's my very great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. First of all, Dr. Arnagretta Hunter, who is a physician and academic. She's both a cardiologist and associated with the Australian National University, specifically a lecturer at the School of Health and Medicine, as well as being associated with the Institute for Climate at ANU. She has worked for quite a few years with climate change and health concerns and implications for policy. She has also chaired the ACT Bushfire Impact Working Group. She's a member, has served on the Commission for Human Futures, also on the ACT Climate Council, and has won many medals, for example, the Sydney Sav medal, and is very well known within climate change circles. So she will lead us through the challenges in relation to climate change from a health perspective. Number two will be Dr. Stephen Crimp from the Australian National University, previously from CSIRO. He's a climate scientist who has worked much of his career with agriculture and food aspects and impacts from climate change and how to manage both the science, the technology, and as well as the policy dimensions. He's deputy head of the climate group within the Institute for, if I can get this right, ANU Institute for Climate, Energy, Disaster Solutions. And he's also leads a CSIRO, ANU and DFAT initiative on resilience for agri-food systems in the Asia or the Indo-Pacific region. So we have two very well-experienced speakers who have got loads of insights to share with us in the next few minutes. So don't forget to enter your questions, comments, challenges for us at the Q&A button, and it's lead us through and think through what's the implications for science, for technology, for policy, and for collaboration across these fields of health, food, and agriculture. So with great pleasure, please, over to you, Arnagretta.
John, thank you so much for that introduction. It really is an absolute privilege to be here, and I particularly enjoy these opportunities for interdisciplinary discussion and to put together the three issues of climate change and health and agriculture makes such a lot of sense in the world that we're in at the moment. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Those who are online today, thank you so much for joining us. I would like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose land I'm sitting today and pay my deep respects to Indigenous culture here in Australia, particularly as we approach this weekend. There is so much to learn from Indigenous understanding of the world, and particularly when I think about health and climate change, it is an essential way of seeing that we hear so commonly, but when we listen to the voices of our Indigenous friends and colleagues. And so it is an opportunity this weekend for us all to give some further thought to the benefits of listening and to learning from a very old continuous culture. I am aware that some of the people online today may have heard me speak on some of these issues previously, and my job is really to provide an overview briefly of where the intersection of health and climate change might sit. And it's particularly interesting, perhaps as by way of introduction, to think that the next COP is the first time we start to see explicit representation from the health sector. Obviously, health sector people have participated on the fringes of the COP negotiations since their inception. But it's not until this year that we're seeing overt participation from the health sector and the health lens. And yet I think, and I hope I make a case today, to show that health should be the major driver. It's an extraordinary prism through which we can approach the challenge of climate change. And it is probably the single most important reason for action is for human survival, which at its core is a health issue. I don't need to remind anybody online today that this year has been an extraordinary year in terms of climate record breaking. I do think Antonio Guterres' comment that we've begun an era of global boiling is a sobering reflection, and it's one that we should all pause and reflect on, particularly as we think about climate policy over the decades ahead. Perhaps right now is the best time to act quite aggressively. And I think that really is the case, that there has never been a more important time to take this seriously. It was important to take it seriously 10 years ago. It would have been fantastic if we were listening to scientists 30 years ago, and even 50 years ago. There was quite good literature written, and I'm thinking particularly of works like The Limits of Growth, which commented on the sorts of challenges that we might find ourselves in now. Climate change is a major health threat around the world today and for the coming decades. And when we start to think about it, we actually are looking at impacts to health and well-being of many, many millions of people around the world. So how do we think about this? Well, at its foundation, the climate, the environment around us, the weather, the biodiversity, these are foundational elements of human health and well-being. And I began thinking about this many years ago. I've been working as a cardiologist now for a while, and I often have thought about the relationship between the places that we live and our health, and particularly through a prism of the sort of food that we have access to, our educational capacity, the houses that we're in, and the built environment, our capacity to get out and do some physical activity, which I think is good for us. And so I'd been thinking about this for quite some time, and I remember being struck deeply in January 2019, where here in Canberra we had a remarkable heat wave. We had 6.3 degrees above the long-term average over that summer, and we had 5 days in a row over 40 degrees, which at that stage was unprecedented. In the 30 years from 1960 to 1990, there were 3 days in total over 40 degrees. And so to have a sequence of 5 days over 40 degrees it's a phase shift, isn't it? It's a significant shift in the local climate. And it was a really hot few weeks from the middle of January to the beginning of February. And so as a cardiologist, I always tell my patients, or we often talk about exercise, how much walking they're doing or what sort of activities they are enjoying. And I was acutely aware as I returned to work after the Christmas period that I started telling people not to exercise. And so I wondered, well, what impact will this have? We've got 3 or 4 weeks of not being able to get outside and do things. And I guess the take-home message from this is not to learn about the biology of heat, but to think about the fact that these environmental variables, and in this case, a heat wave, it's not just impacting on the heart or not just impacting on the kidney. It's not one small part of our human existence that is impacted by the environment, but it's actually every body system that will carry the cost of the heat wave. We see muscle tone change, we see metabolic changes around insulin and glucose and other hormonal regulation. We see blood pressure and heart rate change, mental health effects, effects of bowel and bladder, chronic disease management, and we see an acceleration of frailty when people aren't able to access exercise on a regular basis. It has a large impact on the human organism broadly. And so this got me thinking about how the environment is a foundational element of our health and well-being. And yet it's one that we haven't routinely assessed in our practice. It's not been part of our textbook structure. Of course, we went from January 2019 to the end of the year, and I'm sure so many people on the call today are reflecting on that summer, a black summer, notoriously known as now, of 2019-2020, where those conceptual future risks of what climate change might do to our grandchildren became here and now as the apocalypse unfolded outside our window. Black summer taught us as healthcare practitioners about the importance of air quality being fundamental to human health and well-being, and air pollution causing significant problems. Again, not just with lung disease, but with cardiovascular disease, with increases in infection, with mental health impacts, with supply chain disruptions, and in fact, things like not being able to use our medical imaging equipment in the hospital environment. So the air pollution associated with Black Summer disrupted tremendous elements of our healthcare sector and impacted on healthcare from the very small children to the very elderly and everybody in between. So are there other challenges that will come from climate change? Well, we already know that drought has a physiological and mental health impacts for our health and well-being of communities. We know that flooding and storm damage affects health of affected communities. And in fact, there was a publication just in the last few weeks that showed that the flood impact for cardiovascular and respiratory disease is measured for more than 6 months in a community after a major flooding event. Towns without water. I thought about this a lot in 2019, and I'm thinking about it again. How do we run basic healthcare facilities where water supply has been profoundly disrupted, where the rivers have run dry and where towns are running on bottled water that's being trucked in? And that happened across New South Wales and Queensland in such a large number of places, including not too far out of Canberra. The health service compromise is really important when we think about climate change because of the increase in extreme weather events, particularly fires, floods and droughts, all of which disturb our capacity to deliver health services in their usual way. And of course, we will see changes to patterns of diseases. And in the last few years with our La Nina phenomena, I thought, well, what's going to happen in terms of climate and health? It would be easy to predict in a much wetter than usual period, in unusual patterns of rainfall, that we may see a change in our vector-borne diseases. And of course, we saw Japanese encephalitis rear its head in places that it hadn't been seen previously. And so the vector-borne disease discussion is particularly important as a climate change and health intersection. I have to say heat does get my attention, and I don't know if anybody else on the call has seen the video from Andrew Forrest just recently, but it was quite a remarkable discussion of the ways in which heat will pose a significant threat to many millions of people around the world. Heat is the natural event in Australia that has the highest mortality. That's not well reflected in our health data, again, because we tend to compartmentalise. So when we look at our national health data, we'll look at cardiovascular disease and respiratory disease and infectious diseases and malignancies. And sometimes the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare do a superb job at unpacking that. What are the driving causes and the environments in there? But if you ask people on the street whether heart disease or climate change are more likely to impact on their health and well-being, they're probably going to say heart disease, because it's the cause of death for about 25% of our death certificates. And yet the environment in which we live will no doubt drive a good proportion of the heart disease we see in our community. So how do we look at our data? How do we assess the population impact? And how do we then ameliorate some of the risks that are associated with this? And we did some work on this a few years ago that suggested that perhaps 2% of Australia's mortality is driven by higher than usual temperature periods. And I put the other graph in there just because this is how we normally calculate it. This is Black Saturday, so 2009 in Victoria, that absolutely devastating bushfire event. And I was living in Melbourne at the time. It was an extraordinarily hot period, and it was an extraordinarily fierce fire. And distressingly, about 170 people lost their lives directly from the fire. But this is how we calculate the heat mortality. There were about 350 more deaths than usual over that period in February 2009. And that's attributable to the much hotter than usual temperatures. Air pollution wasn't the major driver. Very high temperatures are emerging as a challenge for human habitation in parts of Australia, and this is particularly an issue for the centre and the north of the Australian continent. And so the question as to how hot is too hot is really important for human health in the same way that it is for any other biological entity. And I suspect Steve might draw on some of this in terms of agriculture. When we look at significant shifts to agricultural viability, that also raises questions for human habitation. How hot is too hot? We know that when we talk about 1.5 to 2 degrees of global warming, that there's a difference between the surface temperature across ocean and surface temperature across land, and that then, of course, on the land mass, that there's a lot of regional variability. And in Australia, the heat vulnerability is particularly in the centre and up north. How hot is too hot is not a particular temperature, but it's a combination of temperature and humidity. And we're already testing the limits for human survival in parts of the centre and Australia during periods of the year, particularly where there's high temperature and high humidity. And I have done some work just in recent time with friends and colleagues from the Northern Territory, particularly around Darwin, and particularly thinking about the Beetaloo Basin as a proposed fracking site, which will have both the direct health impacts from the fracking pollution, air pollution and soil and water contamination, as well as contributing to climate change in what is already a highly climate vulnerable part of Australia. So a few years ago, we had this provocative work from ANU Media saying, let's put climate change on a death certificate. And this is not the argument is not to change the paperwork that's done by doctors at the time that someone passes away. But there really is a challenge here in recognising just how fundamentally important the environment is to human health and well-being, and what will happen to our health and well-being as that climate changes. So what are the models that are available? This is a far from comprehensive list of the sorts of models that are available in terms of health and climate change, but really robust information is easily found at the Lancet Countdown on Climate Change and Health. This is a report that's released every year that assesses the health impacts of climate change around the world and the work that's being done on mitigation and adaptation. And these are the sorts of models that we see connecting a complex web of interconnected factors from global greenhouse gas emissions down to each individual form of disease in health and well-being. I am a little bit of a fan of Kate Raworth's economic strategy in terms of the donut and thinking about the limits. And of course, human health sits within the donut model of planetary boundaries. I think this model is actually quite lovely in that it also shows that dynamic change, that as we see other forms of global pollution, that impacts on our human health and well-being within the donut. But I'm a cardiologist and I like to keep things fairly simple. And so this is the little 3-circle thing that I came up with a couple of years ago and have failed to publish yet. That I thought about how we teach medicine at our medical schools and the way that I've learned my practice of medicine, which is by starting in on the biology of disease, of understanding what is physiological, what is pathological, looking at cellular mechanisms, understanding pharmacology. It's core business in healthcare. It's absolutely essential to the work that we do. And yet, for almost all doctors that I've worked with, there's an increasing recognition as we start to move away from our textbooks and out into the world of actually working with people in places, that there's a more complex layer and often a richer layer around the biology of disease. And there's a dynamic relationship with the social determinants of health impacting then on the biology. And we know this from extraordinary data around the world, including here in Australia, that issues like our education, our work, our geography, the housing that we have access to, all have quite significant impacts on the biology of disease. You're more likely to be diagnosed or less likely to see consequences from disease depending on your social determinants of health. And so that biopsychosocial model has been taught in medical school, and it's how we think about health and well-being, and we have done now for many decades. And so we could perhaps put the climate into the social determinants of health, but I don't think we do that anywhere near well enough. And the other thing I often reflect on is the fact that the environment will definitely still be here even when the social determinants are no longer a driving force. And that is that the environmental influence is bigger than us. The planetary health is bigger than the humans that sit on it. And so the environmental influence impacts on our social determinants and can magnify or ameliorate the social determinants of health and well-being, and has a direct impact on the biology of disease, the rates of disease and the natural history of the sorts of things that many of us will contend with at various points in our life. So I find this a useful model when I'm thinking about climate change, because the environmental influence, the environmental variables, they're core business. Without a good environment around us, our health and well-being, our social determinants are all disrupted. So again, there are some much more sophisticated models for how the environment influences our health and well-being. But again, reasonably simplistically, I see these three variables: the climate broadly, the weather specifically, and then the changes to biodiversity. And each one of those elements impacts on human health and well-being. And coarsely speaking, it does it through these three variables: through the air that we breathe, the food that we eat, and the water that we need to survive. Where and how we live, the built structures, the physical environment in which we find ourselves and the people around us and the ways in which those relationships are facilitated, it's probably a social determinant, but it's certainly in the blurry line because it's significant in terms of the climate, the weather, and the environment more broadly. So those five elements: air, food, water, where and how we live, they're the things that I look at in terms of climate change and health. Air, tremendously important. And again, if I was giving this talk back in 2017, for many of us, it would have been a conceptual thing, unless you've spent a lot of time in cities around the world where urban air pollution is problematic. I think after our Black Summer experience in Australia, we absolutely understand how important it is to breathe fresh air. Air pollution is associated with the development of multiple conditions, including cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, air infections, cancers, etc., and probably drives a significant burden of global premature death and morbidity. So both illnesses and those people who are passing away at a younger than expected age. Food is a big driver, and it's about 55 million people die each year, and it's about 11 million deaths roughly that are attributable to either over or under or poor quality nutrition. So it's a really significant factor in human health and well-being. Don't ask me what the ideal diet is. We could probably spend the next 5 hours debating and discussing that, but food really is central to human health and well-being. The economics of food, access to food, storage of food are all important issues for human health. Supply chain disruption and agricultural compromise impact on human health and nutrition. This nexus between human health, agricultural system and climate change will become, I think, increasingly obvious. I'm a big fan of the work of Sharon Friel and the team at the Hothouse at ANU in RegNet, and Sharon's phrase of the consumptogenic systems, where we see this increasing commoditization of food, the packaging of food, the processing of food. And we know that as we increasingly package and process our food, that it has a worse impact on human health, and that there's a relationship, particularly with cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and obesity, all related to the processing of food. And that processing carries a higher carbon footprint. So there's dual impact of an adverse impact on both the social and environmental side of the business world, as well as the human health impacts from our commoditization of food and the consumptogenic system. Very interesting dynamics. Water, we need water. We need water to wash, water to drink. We know that changes in patterns of rainfall compromise access to drinking and usable water. And this is a bigger issue in the Australian landscape than many of us appreciate. I certainly hadn't appreciated this until the last few years. There are large numbers of regional and remote locations in Australia where drinkable potable water is not reliable. And that then changes of access to good quality water lead to ongoing problems with chronic health conditions, problems like type 2 diabetes because of an alternative source of drinking supply in soft drink, issues around skin infections, and problems like rheumatic fever, which we know is much higher in the Northern Territory in Western Australia than in almost any other part of the world. And we can bring some of that back to the supply of water and the adequacy of housing. Housing comes up as the last slide, and I've nearly finished the health overview. But I think it really is important to look at housing and the sort of built environment that we have as an important index for how the climate around us will impact on our health and well-being. And there's some remarkable work again done out of the Northern Territory, looking not just at water supply, but looking at energy insecurity. And as our temperatures rise, the need to have reliable energy in those spaces. And that includes in Western Sydney as temperatures breach previous records in the western suburbs of Sydney, in socioeconomically vulnerable and environmentally vulnerable parts of Sydney. We need to make sure that people have good access to cooling in order to stay safe and survive very hot temperatures. So just my last two comments, and John, you touched on this at the beginning in the introduction. What I've taken you through today, I think, is largely in the big picture, but it's the challenge when we're working in climate change is seeing the small pieces and then putting that into a larger context. And I've been fascinated, really, when I think about predicting what the years ahead might give us, that we need to look at what has happened historically, and understanding of science is core, but allowing our imagination to be part of this is really important. I mentioned at the beginning how good it is to be part of an interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary discussion between health and agriculture through the lens of climate change. And it's a change in thinking, so we do this more often, that I think will give us the richest solutions for the future. So it's been great to present this bit, and I really look forward to hearing Steve's thoughts on agriculture.
Thank you very much, Arnagretta. That was wonderful, stimulating, lots of food for thought. And indeed, now let's pass over to Dr. Stephen Crimp for the second part of this session.
Thanks, John, and thank you also to ATSI for the opportunity to present some reflections today. So, like Arnagretta, I basically wanted to look at and talk very much about the sort of nexus between climate, health, and food, and think about some of the reflections on those particular issues, but also to think about what is our trajectory of change? How are we bringing these three sort of fundamental areas together in a collective whole to address this particular challenging issue of climate change? So I have a very brief presentation today, and the outline of that presentation really is to think about the system as a whole and spend a little bit of time talking about climate change and climate change implications on food systems and the linkages to health. The second part of that will be looking at some observations of agricultural productivity, because I think that is a particular concern, but it is also a particular focus of the dialogue that we're hearing within the agricultural sciences. There is a focus on yields and productivity and profitability, and it is my view that we need to broaden out that particular discussion to bring in health, to bring in energy, to bring in water, and many other considerations and dimensions. The third part that will be spending a little bit of time on is this idea of what is driving most of the changes or declines in productivity that we're seeing in the observational record, and is this a portent for the future? So focusing some time on the disruptions associated with climate extremes. And then just to finish off, to look at some of the projections that have come out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on the implications for climate change on hunger and food prices. Very sobering figures, and I think that's a very, very strong signal for us to be able to start to think about the multidimensionality and the solutions that we need to produce. So let's think a little bit, or spend a little bit of time on the impacts of climate change on food systems. And I will take you through this somewhat horrendogram. But the idea is that there are many consequences of climate change. And you can see at the top there, we have temperature or heat waves, we have increasing rainfall intensity and flooding. We have changes in the frequency of cyclones or extreme storms in particular, changes in the intensity and the frequency of droughts. Arnagretta talked about the rising average temperatures and the implications for health and labor and productivity, and also changing rainfall patterns. So we have areas, particularly in Australia, where there have been very long-term declining trends in rainfall. There's some regions where they're emerging where rainfall is increasing. But usually what happens is that we focus primarily on this decrease in food yields. We understand the linkages between declining food yields, declining livelihoods and rural livelihoods or incomes, job losses, increased economic pressure. But we spend far less time thinking about the implications and the psychological distress, depression, and the associated health implications of the changing yields. But I would say that we need to broaden out that focus somewhat, and not just think about yields, but also think about the impacts and disruptions that we see emerging now in our value chains and our food value chains, and think about how that, and understand how that is actually impacting on food prices, the availability of food. We're now starting to hear in the media this term called climate inflation, and we see that inflation is being driven by some of these extreme events and disruptions to our important food value chains. But we know as these disruptions increase, we're also starting to see an emerging pattern of consumption change by households. So households are deliberately sourcing food that is cheaper or is available, and that's changing dietary impacts. It's changing the health of communities and livelihoods, but it is also changing and bringing pressure back to bear on agriculture and food producing systems. So we tend to spend far less time, I think, in this far right-hand side of the diagram, which is looking at the implications of disruptions on our food systems, on trade, on gross domestic product, on impacts, on exports and imports, and on the availability of food for those who are in the sort of lower socioeconomic echelons. So we need, I think, to spend a little bit more time when we think about this climate, health and food nexus, thinking about the health dimensions and not just focusing on profitability and production. What I did want to talk about is this idea that we're already starting to see some tangible impacts on our agricultural productivity. And these two graphs, bar graphs here, show the implications of productivity growth in agriculture at a global scale on the left-hand side and at the Australian scale on the right-hand side. And I'll spend a little bit of time focusing first on the global scale. So what you're looking at here is the average percentage annual growth in agricultural productivity over a series of periods. So you can see that the first bar represents the 60s, so the height of the Green Revolution. And we can see during that period, the average growth in agricultural productivity was around almost 3% per year. So productivity was growing. But what was driving most of that productivity growth was this idea and notion of increasing inputs, so increasing fertilizers, increasing herbicides and pesticides, and also opening up more land to agriculture. What is a worrying trend, though, is that we've seen in the most recent period, that 2011 to 2019 period, right at the end of the graph, that the actual average annual growth in agricultural productivity has declined now to just above 2%. So we've gone from almost 3% to down to a growth of 2%. What we are seeing, though, is that within food systems, most of the productivity gains or the efforts to sustain productivity are in what we call total factor productivity, or excuse me, efficiencies, the efficiencies by which we use our inputs and we produce outputs. What is also worrying, though, is that there has been this uptick in the expansion of land and conversion of land into agricultural practice. So despite the increase in that transition of land into agriculture and these improvements in total factor productivity or efficiency, we still have seen that decline in the annual average productivity at a global scale for agriculture. If we focus on the Australian story, I think what starts to emerge there again is this consistent pattern of how extreme the last decade has been and how significant the changes in climate have been on agricultural productivity. So if we focused on the orange bars here for cropping, beef and sheep, that is the average productivity growth over the period 2010 to 2019. So you can see for cropping, that average growth has actually been very small, so less than 0.5%. For the livestock industries, beef and sheep, the productivity has actually been negative, so a decline in productivity in response to the conditions that we've seen play out in the most recent part of the record. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time to provide some insights into that too, because it is really marked in terms of the difference in climatic extremes. And this is a study that was produced by Munich Reinsurance, a major reinsurance company that employs around 2,000 research staff to actually collate information around major disruptions like climate extremes, etc. The analysis that they produced back in 2020 was a comparison between the earlier part of the record, which in this case extended from 1980 to 1999, and compared that with the most recent record, which was 2000 to 2019. And the sort of little dots that you see associated with each of the extremes is a count of those extreme events in a particular period. So you can see for droughts, for instance, in that period 1980 to 1999, they counted 263 events of note around the world. In the more recent period, you can see that figure increased to 338. The most marked increase was in the extremes of flooding and storms. So you can see there almost a threefold increase in floods between the earlier part of the record and the more recent part of the record, and storms, again, a doubling of storm frequencies. So if you added all of those climatic related extremes together, they've almost doubled in the most recent period compared to the earlier part of the record. And we know that in our drive to make our food systems more efficient, that we have vertically integrated our food systems, but by doing that, we've actually we've made them much more sensitive to climate change. And we now have some estimates of how sensitive those food systems are by some of the more recent modeling work. And the next slide really just shows you an example of trying to quantify the extent to which the climate extremes have disrupted agricultural productivity at a global scale. Now, this was a a publication that was released in Nature in 2021 and was a very extensive exercise in trying to understand and tease out exactly how much the observed changes in climate have already impacted our agricultural productivity. And so you can see there is geographical variation, but across, if we average that across the whole globe, the decline in agricultural productivity is estimated to be about 21% since 1961. So if we go back to that very first bar graph that I showed you, which showed a sort of the most recent period of an annual growth in agricultural productivity of 2% per year. What that means is that we basically, since the 1960s, if we were to account for all of the loss in productivity, we could wipe out any productivity gains over the last 10 years, over that period from 1961 to present, because of climate, the climate changes that we've already seen in the observational record. What we do see, though, is that there are some food systems that are much more predisposed to climate extremes, and you can see that on the African continent, as well as some areas along the sort of equatorial zone, where those disruptions have been much more severe, of the order of 26 to almost 35%. And so we can see that when we do these sorts of analysis for the observational records, what this shows is that there are regions that are going to be much more significantly exposed to climate change, and areas that are much more sensitive to those changes when they occur. So I just wanted to end my reflections today before we open up for questions and answers. I just wanted to present some work that's been recently released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which looks at the possible changes in prices and hunger by 2050. And the graph does take a little bit of understanding, but the SSPs, which are the shared socio-economic pathways, are the sort of underlying assumptions by which we produce our climate projections and our estimates of emissions. And so the SSP1 is probably the most modest of the shared socio-economic pathways, and is linked to future changes in temperature of 1.5 to 3 degrees Celsius. The SSP2 and SSP3 are the more extreme shared socio-economic pathways, which result in sort of 3 to 5 and greater than, 3 to about 4, and then 4 above 4 degrees Celsius of warming. So what is clear, if we look at the top part of that graph, which is the percentage change in average world prices, we can see that irrespective of the shared socio-economic pathway, so in essence, if we took that to its logical conclusion, so irrespective of the emissions pathway that we follow into the future, that cereals and livestock prices will continue to rise, and that they will rise depending on the actual pathway or the assumptions that we built into those, anywhere between 10 and almost 20% on average. But you can see there is a much broader distribution there of the potential changes in prices. And similarly, we're very, very likely to see ongoing increases in the populations that are at risk of hunger. And again, irrespective of the emissions scenarios for the future, we're likely to see considerable increases in populations that are exposed to food stress and hunger. And that could be in the order of 20 to 25% based on this modeling work. So I think just to end my reflections, what I would just stress to everyone is that we see quite clearly that we're already on a trajectory of change. This is not an issue that is for the future. it is a complex issue that brings together multiple dimensions, and therefore in order to address and enhance the resilience of our food systems for the future, we need to have these transdisciplinary solutions. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, John, and hand back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Arnagretta and Steve, for wonderful, really insightful presentations on health and agriculture and food in the climate change crisis context. That's just really good. Lots of food for thought there. I'd like to kick off, if I may, with a question to yourself, Arnagretta, which is in the Q&A from Carrie Hilliard. And she reflects on the 2011 Queensland floods studies showing evidence of fetal stress, which has affected infant development at 6 months for both boys and girls. And Carrie's question is, well, do we also have similar evidence in relation to climate change? More generally, I would imagine.
It's a fantastic question. And I think the reality is, from my understanding of the literature, which is always going to be completely incomplete, but when we look for associations between particular phenomena in our community and environmental variables, we find them. We find that temperature change, that changes in humidity, changes in temperature, changes in patterns of weather, changes in increase in extreme events, impacts on all sorts of different elements of our health and well-being. And so air pollution and changes in pregnancy are well understood, I think, and particularly in the urban air pollution environment. And so I would recognise there's some assumptions there that we assume that the PM 2.5 pollution in the urban environment is then transferable when we're talking about bushfires or wildfire PM 2.5, but most definitely impacts on pregnancy when we see long periods of air pollution exposure during that fetal development period, and that potentially that flows then into adulthood. And we know that air pollution exposure and the sorts of exposure that we have for children in utero can influence the rates of chronic disease as we grow older, the rates of risk of developing cardiovascular disease, some risks of different malignancies. So most definitely related. And yes, I think there's still work being done. Now, the politics of health and climate change has been complex, and the research funding for these sorts of questions has been limited in the Australian context. I know after the Black Summer experience, there was about $5 million worth of research put into understanding the impacts on the 12+ million Australians who were exposed to bushfire smoke from that Black Summer experience. And that's less than 1% of the annual spend in terms of medical research in Australia. It's probably a much smaller fraction if we look at not just non-governmental spending. So those questions about the sort of longer term impacts on the developing baby and the child as it grows, I think are really interesting. And I know the Institute of Health and Welfare are looking at it. Yes, these things impact our health long term is the short answer.
Thank you very much, Arnagretta. And you've brought us to the complexity, indeed, once again, of policies, politics, but also the science and the technology. And we could also say the shortage of data in some respects to further our studies.
So if I could, I might just, because that data question is really important. We can learn from what has happened historically, but if we think about Black Summer, that event hadn't happened before. We don't have an historical data set to go back and understand what would happen over the Black Summer experience. And that's my final slide on science and imagination, that understanding some of those biological mechanisms is tremendously important, but that there is a leap of faith that's required, that we are allowed, I think we need to give, as scientists, we need to give ourselves permission to make some biological assumptions, that we know that air pollution has harms across a variety of different parts of our health and well-being. As I said, we need to make that assumption that the urban air pollution teaches us something about events related to the burning of forest. But recognising the need to take those leaps, that we don't need the 20-year follow-up on Black Summer to understand that that really can impact our health and well-being, and it's worthwhile working hard to reduce those risks moving forward.
Definitely in our data systems, moving them past averages, long-term or short-term, and moving towards understanding the variability, understanding the extremes is so critically important. I've got a question here that steps into the policy space for both of you, and it's the strategic question. The National Health and Climate Strategy is due out later this year. Now the question, and clearly food will be one dimension, or should be one dimension of that strategy. Would you both like to reflect on that, starting with Steve and then to Arnagretta, on what you would hope to see come out in this strategy? What are the critical top 3 things, at least, from your different perspectives, that you would desperately want to see within that strategy? Steve, first, please.
Thanks, John. Well, I think if I were to sort of pick 3 priorities, certainly I would like to see some improvement in understanding the sort of nutritional implications of climate change on the food that is produced here in Australia. I think that looking at that sort of nutritional information, we understand that climate change will impact on the micronutrients and nutrient loads of the foods that are produced. There are already some experiments that show quite clearly that there is that change, but we haven't quantified that at scale. We don't understand what the implications are for existing dietary needs. What I'd also like to see is, I think, this sort of interplay between local production and maybe more seasonal consumption of foods, so that we can actually think about the systems, the footprint of our agricultural systems. We can improve the sort of seasonality by which we source our foods, reduce our food miles, source more locally, but understand then what the health implications of doing that are. We certainly don't understand that, and I think, you know, from a third priority, it would be looking at this idea of food, looking at the cost of food and the inflationary pressures, and understanding just what the health implications are of those increasing food pressures, changing consumption patterns on the Australian population.
Thanks, Steve. Arnagretta.
Yeah, look at that. The national climate change and health strategy is just fascinating, really, and it's certainly something that I've been so proud of the work that CAHA has done, particularly in really pushing this for some years. And there's broad health system engagement now in that strategy, and there's been a lot of discussion and debate. And look, just sharing with the group, there's this tension that sits in that strategy, the drafts and the conversations that I've been part of. Is it all just about health sector mitigation and decarbonising our health sector? Or is it recognising the relationship between the environment and our health and well-being? And if we see that the environment is completely central to human health and well-being, then health actually is in agriculture, it's in transportation, it's in our climate change strategy more broadly. And that leads to health in all policies, and there's all sorts of pros and cons to that sort of lens. It actually might lead to what we could get if we used a wellbeing framework, if we started to make decisions at a governmental or at a policy level that wasn't based on a change in our gross domestic product, but was actually related and brought back to what are the impacts on our social health, on the health and well-being of our community, on our physical and mental health, and our collaboration and community-centeredness, and what are the environmental impacts of the policy choices that we make. And taking that sort of a lens of both understanding the health, the human health, and the environmental health impacts of any policy across government, that is really valuable. And that's the sort of paradigm shift which I think we need if we actually want to contend with this challenge in a serious way. We can't look at it in its small silo. We really need to see, actually we need to ask the question, what are we doing and why are we doing it? And Steve, you're making a case to say when we're growing food, we're trying to feed our population, and we're also trying to care for the land so that it's sustainable going forward. We want to look after the farmers and their farming workforce. We want to care for the natural environment, and we want the food that is produced to provide adequate nutrition and good health and well-being for our community. And productivity and growth don't have anything to do with any of those indices. So it's a framework shift which I think can have a really profound impact on health and well-being. What are we here for and why are we doing it? As well as contending with some of the challenges that we face.
Wellbeing framework's one way into it. Of course, the Sustainable Development Goals is another at the international level that's resonated for a long time.
Yep.
You mentioned working at the farm level, producing food with a lower carbon footprint, etc. Steve, there's a question here from David Shearer, actually, who asks about the potential or points to the need for carbon sequestration and points to the opportunities this might bring, not just for Australian farmers, but also smallholders elsewhere. And I'm wondering if that comes into your Indo-Pacific Resilience Initiative. Would you like to very quickly just respond to that?
Yep.
And we've got 4 minutes to run. So
fair enough. I just very briefly go back to the last point as well. I think one of the things it's important not just to focus on the physical health aspects, but also the psychological health aspects, because we know that increasing frequency of droughts and extremes within the agricultural systems and the farmers that operate there has considerable implications for mental health. And I think we probably need to provide a little bit more emphasis on trying to understand those implications. But
go ahead, please.
Moving on to the other issue, I see carbon as an important catalyst for improving the environmental considerations of agricultural practice. So we know that things like carbon sequestration, carbon trading, and generating offsets will provide a fairly small or modest improvement in livelihoods, but it's an important catalyst. If we are increasing and improving the way that we measure our emissions across our food supply chains, we're improving the efficiencies in areas where we know that there are the largest emissions. If we're doing auditing, if we're measuring and creating those baselines, we will improve the resilience of our food systems, and will improve the way in which that food is produced in a more environmentally sustainable way. So while carbon isn't going to be the panacea in terms of an alternative livelihood strategy, I think it's a really important catalyst in getting people to start to think about renewable energy, improve water efficiencies, improve practice, those sorts of things.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, we're running very close to the end of this webinar. Maybe this might be just the first of a series of conversations on this subject. I'd like each of our speakers to reflect on just one point, one takeaway message you would like to leave us all with in relation to this subject matter. And I think we'll say at that moment, I know there's more questions in the Q&A, but what a great apologies that we can't cover them all yet, but there might be an opportunity for a follow-up to those questions, such as Tony Fisher's or Jenny Goldie's or Nick Rose, etc. So let's just go first, please, to Steve, for your one takeaway message you would like listeners to keep in the forefronts of their minds. And then over to Arnagretta.
We understand the complexities of sustaining food production and making sure that it's healthy. It's a complicated and multi-dimensional problem that requires transdisciplinary solutions. So I think we need to break down some of our traditional silos and think about integrating and connecting out with other science disciplines in order to solve this problem.
And I'm going to agree, just following on from that. So one of the things might be to be brave. And there's a question in one of the questions is actually about how we maintain hope. And I tell my children that they're in for a wild ride. Life for them is going to be very different to life for my life as it's been so far. That's both a potential terrifying thing, but it's also an opportunity to do things quite differently. And I think one of the things that we will do differently, that we're going to need to do differently, is exactly what Steve's just said, is much more creative thinking, much more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary thinking and work on solving these problems. And so I'm going to charge the audience to be brave, that next time you're in a meeting that's focused on one particular element of our climate crisis, bring in the other elements, even where you're not deeply expert. It's really bringing in the different perspectives into all of the discussion that, in my experience, adds extraordinary richness, and it gives a different perspective and lens to the sorts of solutions that we can come up with. If you're looking for something to bring the health lens, and when we take the health lens into any of these elements, we will often come up with a solution that is both good for people and place.
Well, thank you very much, Arnagretta. That's two excellent thoughts there. I'd like to extend a huge thanks to our two speakers who have been excellent, really valuable, great insights with really important messages. Thanks to the audience as well for your questions. That's really good, and we might endeavour to follow up those questions that we haven't addressed fully in this session. We'd like to say thanks to the Academy as well for this webinar, and to say that we are open to suggestions about additional follow-up webinars that might be related to this subject or other subjects going forward in relation to the Ag and Food Forum, or more generally within the Academy. So once again, thank you all very much. Very well done, very excellent. And please keep those two messages in mind from Stephen and from Arnagretta.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Great sharing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.